Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Provost Lecture, and thank you for being here. We're fortunate to have the renowned social demographer and sociologist, Dr. Andy Cherlin, as today's lecturer. Dr. Cherlin is a professor at the Johns Hopkins Zanvil Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, which, as you probably know, is located on the Homewood campus in Baltimore. And it's the direct descendant of the original Johns Hopkins University. Now, one of the characteristics that defines the modern Johns Hopkins University is the geographic distribution of our campuses and programs. Our physical separation has always tended to foster a sense of independence and self-reliance among the various schools and divisions of Johns Hopkins University. We're a self-starting, entrepreneurial, and adventurous organization. But our geographic distribution has downsides as well. When your campuses are miles apart, you tend to develop different cultures, different mindset, and even different languages. People who are separated and to some degree sequestered tend to build walls. So distance can become an impediment to the transdisciplinary focus and teamwork that is the essence of nearly all contemporary research and scholarship. One of the goals of this lecture series is to bring outstanding scholars from one school or campus of our university to another, so that we may all learn from their expertise. Before Dean Einhorn introduces Professor Cherlin, I'd like to share with you some information about the Zanvil Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. Through its 22 departments, the Krieger School focuses on the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. The school enrolls about 3,500 undergraduates, or 70% of the university's full-time undergraduate population. Many of these students major in one of the school's many interdisciplinary programs, such as international studies, neuroscience, or public health studies. In addition to having nearly 1,000 full-time graduate students, Krieger also has a significant number of part-time students, with about 2,200 professional students enrolled in master's degree or certificate programs. With fewer than 300 tenure-track professors, the Krieger School is small, but its accomplishments are extraordinary, and the stature of the school's students and faculty are much greater than its size would imply. The Krieger School continues to emphasize investigation, inquiry, and discovery. Like the university at large, the school is guided by the belief that teaching and research are not separate endeavors. The Krieger School's Department of Sociology, where Dr. Cherlin is a professor, is also small compared to its peers, with 13 professors and 40 graduate students. But like the Krieger School, the department has an impact that is far greater than its size. The department is highly ranked by its peers and provides students with a unique opportunity for research and scholarship. The department's areas of expertise cover the sociology of education, world systems analysis, the family, labor, international development, political sociology, immigration, welfare policy, and racial and ethnic issues. Interdisciplinary by nature, the Department of Sociology concentrates on cross-national comparative research and social inequality as its faculty continues to push the envelope of scholarship in the field. Last year, the department celebrated a significant milestone, the 50th anniversary of its founding as the Department of Social Relations at Johns Hopkins University. In this year of demography at SAIS, we've all been reminded of the invaluable role of demographic studies in enhancing our understanding of human society, from the prospects for the alleviation of poverty to the impact of divorce rates on American family life. Dr. Cherlin's research goes beyond recounting population trends and explores relationships among economic, social, cultural, and biological processes that influence populations. Today, Dr. Cherlin will help us to better understand our American society in the global context by exploring how we differ in regard to that most basic building block of society, the family. I'd like to thank SAIS and Dean Einhorn for hosting today's lecture, and now I'd like to invite Dean Einhorn to the podium to introduce Dr. Cherlin. Thank you.
So we're so delighted with this lecture that we're having 2 warm-up acts, not just one. So on behalf of the SAIS community, welcome to Professor Cherlin and to all our guests from SAIS and beyond. The Provost Lecture Series is a wonderful innovation at the university, allowing each division to choose a speaker from another division whose work they admire. In our case, when the provost asked, I didn't have to hesitate. I said we would like the opportunity to hear Dr. Andrew Cherlin, whose demographic work we had learned about. This is Year of Demography at SAIS. Each year, our school embraces a subject of importance in international affairs, which can be the occasion for multidisciplinary work outside the classroom. At all 3 of our campuses, actually, we look at demography this year. Last year, for example, was Year of Religion, and we celebrated Passover with a lecture by Krieger School professor Mark Kaplan. The year before was Year of Water, which led to a panel including Kellogg Schwab of the Bloomberg School and Professors Boland and Ball from the Whiting School of Engineering. For demography, early on, I asked Dean Newman to whom I should turn, and that is how I came to learn about the work of Dr. Cherlin before the provost asked, and so I was ready. Dr. Cherlin's research focuses on the sociology of families and public policy. He began his highly successful affiliation with Johns Hopkins in 1976 as an assistant professor in the sociology department, with a joint appointment already in what would come to be named the Bloomberg School's Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. A decade later, he had become a full professor, and in 1993, he stepped into his chair as Benjamin Griswold Professor of Public Policy. Dr. Cherlin has received widespread recognition for his work, including the Olivia Nordberg Award for Excellence in Writing in the Population Sciences, and in 2009, the Irene B. Teuber Award from the Population Association of America in recognition of his outstanding accomplishments in demographic research. For 3 years, ending in 2009, Dr. Cherlin directed the Hopkins Population Center, and last year he took on the responsibility of acting chair for the Sociology Department. Truly, his books, articles, and professional affiliations are way too numerous to try to highlight, except to say that quite exceptionally in academia, most of Dr. Cherlin's books have titles that make you want to read them. From his first book, Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage, to his 2009 Knopf book, The Marriage Go Round, on the state of marriage and the family in America today. Dr. Cherlin brings scientific method to our anecdotal experiences and derives his public policy views from his examined experience. What a lovely world to escape to, that one based on facts and examined experience during this election cycle in the last few days in Washington. Dr. Cherlin's education ideally prepared him for his life of scientific research for public policy. He earned a Bachelor in Science in Engineering and Applied Science at Yale and a PhD in Sociology at UCLA. Tonight, we have the treat of hearing about what makes our family lives different from those in other wealthy nations. For our budding SAIS couples, of whom we have quite a few, many of whom come from and embrace multicultural relationships within and outside the wealthy countries, this may be the beginning of a long conversation. So without more ado, thank you, Provost, for the gift of this evening, and thank you, Dr. Cherlin, for a wonderful contribution to our Year of Demography. The podium is yours.
Well, thanks to the Provost and to the Dean for those great, gracious introductions. My thanks to the Provost for the idea of this Provost Lecture Series, which is sending professors from one campus to another. A great idea. Why we didn't think of this sooner, I'm not quite sure. Thanks to Vice Provost Rulak for helping set up all this. And my gracious thanks to Dean Einhorn for inviting me, for hosting me, and for allowing me to be part of your Year of Demography, which I'm very pleased and excited to do. I'm going to talk to you a bit about marriage and about families in the U.S. And most of the material that I'm going to talk about comes from this book, The Marriage Go-Round. It should really be called The Marriage and Cohabitation Go-Round, but try telling that to an editor in New York. It was published last year and tells a bit about how families in the U.S. are unique and different from other countries and why and what that means. Now, to get a sense of why the U.S. is different from other countries, all you have to do is walk down the street in Baltimore. And when you do, you see buses going by with banner ads saying this, okay? Those actually are on the sides of buses in Baltimore. Smiling couples saying marriage works. Also, they're billboards saying married people earn more money. And I actually saw a couple of these coming out of a metro in D.C. a couple of years ago. Maybe that some of you have seen that. So there were some in D.C., but in Baltimore there's been a big campaign. I submit to you, there is not another country in the world where you would walk down the street and see these kinds of ads. This is peculiarly American and says something about how we care about families and what we care about, a subject I'm going to delve into for you. So the first thing the ad shows is we really think marriage is important, and without doubt we do. But not only do we think marriage is important, and not only do we marry a lot, but in addition, we have the highest divorce rate in the Western world. So we marry a lot, we divorce a lot, and people who divorce, we marry often, in a way that's much greater than in other places. The results of this, I want to summarize for you in a couple of charts, are that we have lots of disruption and lots of bringing back together. Here's a chart that shows the percent of marriages ending in divorce within the first 5 years of marriage. Okay, so you get married, how many people have disrupted within the first 5 years? I want to show you the comparison of the US and other countries. In the United States, almost a quarter of all marriages are disrupted, separated or divorced by 5 years. Almost 1/4. That's much higher than in other countries. In Sweden, which we think of as this vanguard European country, it's half as much. Very little in Spain, very little in Italy. In any other country you go to, France, Belgium, Finland, it's much lower. In Canada, it's much lower. There's no place that has a divorce rate as high as the US. Now you might say, if you know something about Europe, yes, but that's because they don't get married anymore in Europe, right? They just live together. So let's look at what happens to people who live together in the US versus other places. So here is the percent of cohabiting relationships, cohabiting meaning living together outside of marriage, that disrupt after 5 years. Maybe they get married, maybe they don't. All I'm looking at here is if you start out living together, are you still living together in the first 5 years? And you can see that although the lines are bigger for every place, if you look at the bottom line, it shows that in the United States, the cohabiting relationships have the highest probability of breaking up. More than half of them break up within the first 5 years. And that's a much higher rate than any place else. Our cohabiting relationships are much shorter than in any other country. We live together for a couple of years, and typically either we get married or we break up, and increasingly it's a breakup. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with charts, so let me just go through a few points here of my basic demographic presentation of why the US is different, okay? So Americans marry and cohabit for the first time sooner than people in other countries, other Western countries. Sooner meaning at a younger age. Okay? We tend to get married even now, when ages are older, at a younger age than other countries. In addition, a higher proportion of Americans marry at some point in their lives than in any other Western nation. So more of us get around to it eventually, even if we postpone it, than in other places. In addition, marriage and cohabiting unions in the US are far more fragile, and I just showed you a couple of charts to prove that. Okay? Our marriages don't last as long. We have a much higher divorce rate. Our cohabiting relations don't last as long. But not only do we disrupt a lot, Americans also, we partner, and in addition, as a result, American kids born to married or cohabiting parents are more likely to see their parents' union break up than in other countries. Okay, so kids see a lot of disruption, but because there's more repartnering, American kids see more new people coming in. American children who've seen their parents' partnership and are more likely to have another adult partner come into the house, living together or married, than kids elsewhere. So we bring somebody in new quicker. What all this means is there is a great turbulence, a great turnover, a great amount of people coming in and out of the households in the US, and American kids see far more people moving in and out. They're much more likely to see a series of people than our kids in other countries. As I'll show you, if you beg my indulgence, in what I think is, for me, the key chart that really got me interested in writing a book about this. This chart shows, it compares kids in the US with kids in a number of other countries using a set of comparable surveys that was done in the mid-1990s. I'm going to show you the percentage of children who are living with their mother who experience 3 or more maternal partnerships by age 15. Now, what do I mean by that? Kid's living with his mother. The mother starts out married, gets divorced, the kid remains with his mother, a new man comes in, that guy leaves, and a third man comes in by age 15, okay? Or a child is living with a single parent, and by age 15, she has cycled through 3 or more different partners, okay? How common is that? Well, in a lot of countries, it rarely happens. For instance, if you look at the bottom of this chart at Belgium, the number next to that Belgium line is 0.1, meaning 0.1% of all children experience this much turnover in Belgium. It doesn't happen. Okay? It doesn't happen there. 1 in 1,000. In Italy, just about the same. In Spain, not much more. And as you go up this chart, you'll see that even in France, only 0.5% of all kids experience this much turnover. That's 1 in 200. Still very uncommon. Gets a little more common in other places. In Sweden, it's more common than any place else in Europe. 2.3% of all kids have that much turnover. In the US, it's 8.2, okay? Our kids are 3 times more likely to experience that much turnover than are our kids in other European countries, even supposedly avant-garde countries in Scandinavia. So there is a lot of turnover, and kids see parents and parents' partners coming in and out. And what I think is really the key difference between American families and families elsewhere, it's not just that we get married a lot. It's not just that we get divorced a lot. It's not just that we get repartnered a lot. It is the combination of those creating a turnover in partnership that you're unlikely to see in most any other developed country, or even in most any other developing countries as well. So that's what happens to American kids. Now, it doesn't happen to American kids randomly. It's less common among American kids whose parents went to college, who do better financially, than among kids whose parents didn't. So it varies by education, it varies by race, but maybe not just in the way you might think. Here's a chart that shows the percentage of women, and now back to women rather than kids, who have experienced 3 or more partnerships by age 35, okay? And I'm going to show you this first by race. And you will see that the racial group that has the largest number of women who experience multiple partnerships are whites, not minority groups. And now I'm going to show you a breakdown by education, and you'll see that it's least common for college graduates, a bit more common for people who have some college, a bit more common for people with high school degrees, but somewhat less common for people without high school degrees. In other words, if you want to think of a stereotypical image of a woman who has 3 or more partnerships in the US, don't think of a poor minority woman. Think of a white woman with a high school degree who, with her partners, is still not giving up on marriage, still trying to reach for that American dream of having a partner, and is willing to start those partnerships, wants to start those partnerships, but is increasingly these days starting them in an economic climate that's not very favorable. In fact, the high school educated, as most people know, have been the hardest hit by the big transformations on our economy over the last few decades that have decimated the kinds of jobs that somebody with a high school degree but no college degree might get. In other words, the jobs that used to sustain that kind of working class marriage are now fading away. And in fact, my next project, which I'll tell you about if you invite me back here 3 years from now, is to look at the working class American and at the way in which they are marrying less, going to church less, kind of disengaging from the middle class in a very troubling way because I think of the trends in our economy. So that's a bit about what's happening demographically and what I think is distinctive about the U.S. And now the question is, why is that happening? Okay, if what's distinctive is all this turnover, what's this all about? And let me give you what I think. Let me give you my argument for what I think this is all about. I think it's about the contradictions of American culture. We tend to think of culture as some kind of consistent set of values that we learn as kids and that stay with us and that always give us one answer to any problem we foresee. But actually, that's not how culture works, especially today. Culture can be contradictory. We can have more than one answer. We can have more than one way of framing a problem. And that's what I think happens in our family life. I think we have two models, mental models in our head about family lives. The first I'll call the cultural model of marriage, or you might call it the cultural model of hierarchy, order, structure. People who believe in marriage as a way of ordering family life and who think it's very important. This cultural model of marriage is very central and important in the U.S., more so than in most other countries. Here, for example, is a set of responses to some surveys that were done around the globe around the year 2000, comparable surveys in many, many countries. People asked the same questions. It's called the World Values Survey. I'll come back to it. And here's a question that was asked. Do you agree or disagree with this question? Marriage is an outdated institution. Let me show you some wealthier countries. In the U.S., only 10% of people disagree. That is to say, most people in the U.S. do not think marriage is outdated. Okay? In Italy, a little higher, think it's outdated. The Germans, a little more outdated. The Swedes, twice as many of them as in the U.S. say marriage is outdated. Canadians a bit more. And all the way up to the French, who at 36% are the country that has the distinction of having the most number of people who think marriage is an outdated institution. And so we think marriage still matters. And we think it's something that marital stability is important. And when people in America are asked about marriage, they respond in that kind of way. Yes, marriage is important. You should stay together. For instance, in one survey, a representative sample of adults was asked this question. Marriage is a lifetime relationship that should never be ended except under extreme circumstances. Do you agree, neither agree or disagree with that statement? Well, 76% of Americans agree that marriage is a lifetime relationship that should never be ended except under extreme circumstances. Only small numbers agree, disagree, or aren't sure. So we think marriage is important. We have that model in our head. But at the same time, I would argue, we have another model, what I would call the cultural model of individualism. The cultural model that allows you to think about personal development, self-development. That's important for us and also has been. And that model is there too. And I'll give you a good example of how people can flip back and forth between those two models. Remember that question I just told you about? Remember those 76% of people who said marriage is a lifetime relationship that should never be ended except under extreme circumstances? Okay, I now want to take that 76%. I'm throwing away the other 24%. 20 minutes later, in the same survey, they were asked another question. It was, when a marriage is troubled or unhappy, it is generally better for the children if the couple stays together. Now, wouldn't you think that people who just told you 20 minutes ago that marriage is a lifetime relationship that should never be ended except under extreme circumstances would say, yes, when a marriage is troubled or unhappy, it's generally better if the couple stays together. But they don't. Only 25% of those people agree with that. 35% aren't sure, and 40% disagree. Now, how can this be? It can be because people have a couple of different models in their head. And if you cue them one way, they respond using one model. If you cue them another way, they respond with the other. If you cue them in a way that says, is marriage important? Should we stay together? Is stability important? They say, oh, yes. Yes, it is. Then if you say, is personal choice important? Which is basically what that divorce question is saying. Do you have the right to opt out if you want to get out of a relationship? Because personal choice, individual growth is important. They flip without even thinking about it. So there is a book out now called Red Families versus Blue Families, which claims that families are have a very different set of values in the states that vote Republican than in the states that vote Democratic. It finds cultural differences between families. I would argue that there's some of that, but we have cultural differences within families, in fact, within individuals in our heads. Most of us carry around both of the kinds of values, the kind of traditional value we see and the individualistic value we see. We may weight them differently, but most of us have both models in our minds in a way that is evident and is particularly American. I say it's particularly American because the kinds of values we have, the convergence of the two models I've talked about, is not really found anyplace else. The person who did these world value surveys is a political scientist named Ronald Inglehart. And he's looked at values around the world based on the kinds of questions you've seen before, and has compared the U.S. to other countries. And he says that the U.S. is a deviant case. Okay, what does he mean by that? He means that he can't find another country that is high on what he calls self-expressive values, but also high on what he calls traditional values. That is to say, Americans value self-expressive values. What do I mean by that? Tolerance for alternatives, tolerance for other lifestyles, the importance of personal choice. Americans value that highly, but at the same time they tend to value traditional values, such as God being very important, abortion being not justifiable, a strong sense of national pride, a respect for authority. You can find developed countries that are high on traditionalism, like, say, Italy. You can find developed countries that are high on individualism or self-expression, like, say, Sweden. But you can't find another one that is high on both. It is that peculiar set of values that makes the U.S. distinctive and that creates this ferment that we're seeing now in every election year among these competing values. So that's what makes the U.S. different. When I go to Europe and I talk to them about the U.S. and about marriage, they're always puzzled by it. Because it turns out for the Europeans, marriage is not as important. And what's more important is fertility, i.e. having children, who has children. It's all about marriage here, and it's all about fertility there. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not totally. Europe is a place where births began to decline early, and particularly in France. The birth rate began to decline in France in the mid-1800s, way before any place else. And ever since, the French have been nervous about having enough French citizens to defend the country against aggressors, particularly the Germans, okay? And World War I and World War II did very little to assuage those fears. So the French and many other European countries want more babies. They want higher populations. And they care about that a lot in ways we don't particularly care about. For instance, in vitro fertilization, assisted fertilization, test tube fertilization, implantation in uteros, we're pretty laissez-faire about which young adults can get those kinds of services. But in many European countries, unmarried couples can't, or lesbian couples can't. Why? Because they care very much about who can have children and under what conditions, because that's the issue for them. Here, we don't care as much about that. In most states, at most assisted fertility centers, lesbian couples can get served. But let somebody talk about same-sex marriage in the U.S., and we're beside ourselves, okay? In a way they're not in many European countries. The same-sex marriage debate in the U.S. has been much more contentious than in most European countries. The reason is because, first of all, so much is at stake here. People care so much about this. The reason why France and Britain have domestic partnerships but not same-sex marriage, which is the way things are, is there's not as much agitation in favor of same-sex marriage on the part of gay and lesbian activists, because they say, wait a minute, why do I want to buy into this dying institution at the beginning of the 21st century? Why would I want to be married? And so they say, domestic partnership's good enough. Or they're in other countries where same-sex marriage is passed without much debate. This is the only country where it's a bit of battle, a war zone, because this is the country where it matters most, where who owns marriage is most central to the kind of values that we've had. Now, some distinctive cultural set of values like this can't exist in a vacuum. It has to be supported by something. There has to be something that makes the U.S. So distinctive and keeps it that way. And I want to talk about some of the factors that make the U.S. distinctive. In particular, I want to talk about American religion. Okay? I don't have to tell you that American religion supports marriage. I did just tell you that. But I'm not going to spend any time on it because you all agree. But I'm going to suggest that religion also in some ways enables the kind of individualistic view of marriage that we have here in the U.S. And that although some of American religion may be conservative, very little of it is traditional. And I'll show you what I mean. First of all, the reason I'm picking religion is it's the obvious suspect for any cultural difference between the U.S. and Europe, for example. The reason is we go to church and synagogue and mosque so much more often than do people in most other countries. Here from the World Values Surveys is the percentage of people who say they attend religious services once a month or more frequently. Okay, so you go to church at least once a month. In Sweden, only 9%. In France, only 12%. You know those great cathedrals that you go to when you visit France? Go there on Sunday morning and you'll find there's nobody there except tourists. Nobody goes to those cathedrals. In other countries, it's a bit more. In Canada, it's a bit higher. In Italy, where the Pope lives, it's 54%. In the US, it's 60%. The only country where people go to church more often is Ireland, where 67% say they go to church that often. Now, there's probably some wishful thinking in these responses, okay? Nevertheless, relatively speaking, it certainly seems to be the case that we're in the top tier in how often we go to church. Not only that, but we think we find good lessons there, lessons that are relevant for our family life. There's another question in this set of this World Values Surveys that says, generally speaking, do you think that the churches in your country are giving adequate answers to the problems of family life? This is the percent of people saying, yes, the church is giving adequate answers. The Swedes, forget about it. Only a small number of them think that the church is giving adequate answers. Not many more in the other countries. In Ireland, you'll notice, only 27% think that the church is giving adequate answers to the problems of family life, although 67% go to church all the time, suggesting that whatever they learn there, they don't particularly think is helping them all that much. But in the US, cut to the top, you'll see that we lead all countries in saying, yes, we get lessons that are relevant for our family life. Well, what lessons do we get? Yes, we get lessons that marriage is important. But we also get lessons that self-development is important, that individualism is important, in ways that people don't tend to think. In fact, when you look at religion and divorce, you find, first of all, that divorce has always been more common in the U.S., going back to the Revolutionary years. Here's a divorce petition from Connecticut in 1789, when the Connecticut political and moral leaders were beside themselves about the high divorce rate, which was like 10. Per persons per state, per year. Nevertheless, a historian tells us that for 2 centuries, commentators have singled out America as the home of divorce, as the place where marital exits lived. America has always been a comparative divorce haven. But doesn't conservative religion discourage divorce? Well, not a lot, it turns out. There's a religious scholar who writes about conservative Protestantism, Brad Wilcox, who writes that Protestant discourse regarding divorce and remarriage is characterized by a striking level of ambivalence and dissensus, by which he means Protestant churches have no ambivalence or dissensus about same-sex marriage, they're against it, okay? Or abortion, they're against it. But there's a wide range of positions about divorce, and which is odd because divorce affects far more of their parishioners than same-sex marriage does. Nevertheless, divorce is, if not approved of, at least something that one accepts and one ministers to. And it's true not only in conservative Protestantism, but in the Catholic Church. Now, there is no divorce in the Catholic Church. Okay, the Catholic Church does not allow divorce. It does allow annulments. What is an annulment? An annulment is a ruling that your marriage did not follow church law when it was started, Therefore, it never started correctly. Therefore, it never happened. Okay, it is a no. And one of the ways in which a marriage can be done incorrectly is the following. The Catholic Church says marriage requires free consent and voluntary consent on the part of both partners. If not, it's not a valid marriage. Now, until the last couple of decades, not many annulments were granted by the Catholic Church. In the 1960s, only about 500 annulments were awarded in the entire country. Then came something called Vatican II, a Congress in Rome that changed much about the Catholic Church and its doctrine. And one of the things it changed was a broader view of what personal and free choice is, which has been interpreted as follows. Suppose that when you married your husband or wife, you really didn't understand what they were like in terms of their personality. Okay? You didn't fully grasp what they were about, what their interests were, and therefore you didn't really know them. So therefore you couldn't really give free consent, because how could you have given free consent if you didn't really know them well enough to give free consent? And believe it or not, in most dioceses in the US, this argument, if supported by enough facts, can be enough to get an annulment. So that by the mid-1980s, the Catholic Church is giving 50,000 annulments a year. Annulments have become de facto divorce among the Catholic Church. So yes, there is no divorce, but there is annulments on an enormous scale compared to the past. Why? Because the Catholic Church is kind of through the back door letting in the issue of personal choice, personal development, individualistic views of relationships into the marriage bargain. So we have both Catholics and conservative Protestants giving us a message that's not pro-divorce, but which allows it. And I don't mean to suggest that religion encourages divorce, but it does encourage self-development. An individualistic way of thinking about life. And it always has to some extent, it is the case here. What is this survey? Okay. It is the case that religions do this. However, somebody might say, don't religious Americans get divorced less than non-religious Americans? Well, the answer is yes, that's right. However, religious Americans get divorced more than people in most any other country. Okay? Here is the percentage of unions begun as, I'm going to go back to the previous, percentage of marriages ending in separation or divorce in 15 years. Okay? That is to say, what percentage of marriages have broken up? As you can see down there at the bottom, only 8% of the Italians have broken up. A little further up, it shows that 28% of the Swedes have broken up. Just about that, you see the figure for Americans who said in a national survey that religion was very important to them. 41% of them have broken up. In other words, religious Americans get divorced more than godless Swedes. Okay? Now, non-religious Americans get divorced even more. Okay? So they put a very high ceiling on the American divorce rate, but religious Americans put a high floor that's above the ceiling in most other places. And if you still think that this is all because none of the Swedes get married, if you just look at the percent of cohabiting unions that end in separation in 15 years, it shows the same pattern with religious Americans ending their relationships more than others. So even religious Americans have a high rate of divorce relative to other countries, although in the US it's the case that the non-religious divorce even more. Religion then does encourage self-development, and it always has to some extent. This is a photo of the great etching of the great religious revival meetings in the 1800s. There were these huge religious camp meetings in which speakers roused the flock, who, as you can see from this picture, are falling all over themselves, falling on the ground, writhing in spiritual ecstasy as they individually express themselves to God. And one of the great preachers said what he tried to do when he was preaching was raise an excitement among them. That kind of excitement, that individual expression, has always been part of American religion, and it still is. Let me show you that it still is by giving you a couple of examples from current popular religion. First, an easy example. This is Joel Osteen. Not all of you may know Joel Osteen. He is the heir to the tradition of positive thinking. There was a famous preacher, author in the mid-20th century named Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, about how if you gave yourself to God and thought positively, good things would happen to you. And they do in the stories he tells about other people. Osteen is the pastor of the church, the megachurch with the largest attendance in the U.S. It's held in a building which used to be the home for the Houston Rockets of the National Basketball Association, but it's too small, so they have to have 2 or 3 services a week in order to get the 40,000 people a week who come to his services. Not to mention the 7 million people who watch his TV show every Sunday morning. Not to mention the best-selling books, such as these, which sell in the millions, all of which tell you to think positively. In fact, Osteen says you should think favor-minded, by which he means expect favors from God. And if you expect favors from God and think favor-minded, good things will happen to you. Now, Norman Vincent Peale told lots of stories about other people he met. Joel Osteen tends to tell stories about himself. For instance, he tells the following story to show the value of thinking favor-minded. He was in an airplane, sitting in his seat. They were still at the gate, but everybody had boarded. Suddenly, a flight attendant comes up to him and says, "Mr. Osteen, please come with me." And they take him up to first class. And the flight attendant says, "We did this because we needed another seat in coach for somebody else." And Joel says, "But I knew. I knew the real reason I went to first class was because I was thinking favor-minded. I was expecting favors from God, and that's why I was moved to first class." He tells a story about how one Sunday afternoon, he was taking his family to a park in Houston where it's very difficult to find a parking space, but he was thinking favor-minded. And you know what? He got a great parking space right next to the park. He tells about how he hit the winning shot at a pickup basketball game because he was thinking favor-minded. And more crucially for my argument, he talks about his father, who it turns out got divorced. This was terrible, he said, but his father then decided to accept God's forgiveness, and God gave him a new start. Okay, so divorce isn't good. It's a bad thing. But if you've been divorced, if you accept God's forgiveness, if you think favor-mindedly, then God will forgive you, and good things can happen to you. That's the message of these books. Okay, the message is one of personal growth and self-development that would fit in any non-religious category that you've seen fit in before, as well as a message of religion. This is sometimes called prosperity theology, although there's not much theology. Amazon.com used to do a concordance of best-selling books, where right on the website they give you the 100 most heavily used words in order, from 1 to 100. So when Your Best Life Now is still on the bestseller list, the most common word was God, which appeared 1,788 times in the book, but neither Jesus nor Christ made the top 100. Instead, Joel and money both made the top 100. Okay? Now, it's easy to say, well, this is just, some pop religion, and it is some pop religion. It's not representative of all religions, but it is the largest church in the U.S. It is a source of bestsellers and of TV messages which millions of people see, which tells them marriage is good, divorce is bad, but if you're divorced, we can help you. It's okay. We will minister to you. Now, that's the easy case, okay? The harder case to show you that there is a self-development orientation in contemporary religion along with its conservative bent is from this book, okay? This is The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. Warren, you probably know. He gave the benediction at Obama's inauguration, somewhat controversial because of his stands on gay marriage, which he's against. He has written a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. He's the pastor of Saddleback Church, a megachurch. Business Week reported in 2005 that this book had become the fastest-selling book of all time, with more than 23 million copies sold. many of them in bulk to churches, many of them in bulk to churches overseas in other countries. Okay? So that was 2005. He's had another 5 years to sell the book since then. What does he tell you in this book? Well, he says that God has designed a purpose for everybody's life, and your task is to find what your purpose is. Now, he's here to help you do that through his book. Warren, to his credit, takes great efforts to separate himself from the kind of positive happiness, positive thinking, self-oriented view. He says in the first sentence of the book, it's not about you. He's rejecting that. Nevertheless, if you read the book, it fits into this self-help tradition. What is this book about? It has 40 short chapters. And the author says, this is more than a book. It is a guide to a 40-day spiritual journey that will enable you to discover the answer to life's most important questions. What on earth am I here for? And so each day, you're supposed to read one chapter, and there's questions at the end of the chapter. The questions are like, what practical choices will I make today in order to grow closer to other people? What problem in my life has caused the greatest growth in me? You're supposed to meditate on those after reading the chapters. And here is a couple of sentences from the book which I think encapsulate its approach. The sentences say, Christianity is not a religion or a philosophy. Quite a statement, if you ask me. I thought it was a religion, maybe a philosophy. Christianity is not a religion or a philosophy, but a relationship and a lifestyle. The core of that lifestyle is thinking of others as Jesus did instead of ourselves. Now, in that second sentence, Warren rejects the self-oriented Osteen type of religion. But in that first sentence, he's embracing the same kind of self-development, a quest for personal growth, because a relationship is personal. It's something you have directly with God. It's individualistic. And a lifestyle is something that you choose. It's optional. So what he's saying is that Christianity is not a moral code. It's rather something you construct by establishing a personal relationship with God, choosing how to live your life, choosing the way in which you could serve others, and that's what his book helps you to do. Now, the problem is, once you let the genie of self-development out of the bag, as it were, to try to get people to figure out how to help others, they tend to generalize it. They tend to generalize the idea that I should make choices and think about what's best for me to other areas of their lives, such as, say, their family lives. And it becomes a way in which you may enable the same kind of self-development that you're fighting against. A very good political scientist named Alan Wolf has said that American religion may be conservative, but it's not traditional. There's nothing traditional about Rick Warren. He may be conservative in his views about same-sex marriage, but he's very postmodern in the way he's telling you to live your life and think about things. There's nothing conservative about Joel Osteen. I'm sorry, traditional about Joel Osteen. He may be conservative, but he's far from traditional in how he's telling you to focus on whether you too can get upgraded to first class. Okay? American religion has both models. Both of those models I talked about, the model of marriage and the model of individualism, is there. And people flip back from one to the other in deciding how to live their lives. Now, it's not just religion that supports these two models. American law also supports it. I don't have time to go into this in any detail, but our legal system supports both marriage and individualism. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, it supports the individualistic view, the kind of allowing divorce view, by the fact that we have the shortest waiting period to no-fault divorce of any country. That is to say, you can get a divorce without proving the other person at fault within a couple of years, sometimes 1 year in most states. We allow divorce more liberally than in other countries. At the same time, we have continuing legal battles over things like same-sex marriage. Legal battles that don't exist in other countries, where marriage is not the contentious thing it is today. So both law and religion support these cultures. And I know I've talked about this as if it's totally cultural. There are economic factors. The fact that especially working class adults can no longer have the kind of economic security that they used to means that although they may want to marry, they may not be able to, that they may be directed toward other ways of thinking about marriage. And so it's not just a cultural phenomenon, but I do think the differences between the US and the other countries are heavily. Now, okay, what do we do about this, okay? Should we be concerned about this? Well, for adults, I'm not sure the idea of going through multiple partners is necessarily something that should be an object of public policy, because adults can freely choose their partners. And as long as children aren't involved, you could argue that it's to the benefit of some adults to, by trial and error, so to speak, find themselves with a partner. But if children are involved, and they are, and if children are experiencing large amounts of turnover, and I've showed you that they are, then I think it is an issue. What then do we do about it? Well, there has been a message in American policy over the last 10 years or so about what to do it, and the message has been simple. Get married and stay married, okay? That has been the political emphasis of American policy, family policy, throughout the 2000s, certainly, during both terms of the Bush administration, when pro-marriage, get marriage rhetoric was pretty much the whole ballgame. Now, marriage, when it works well, is an optimal way of providing stability and security for kids, I think. Optimal may be too strong, but it certainly works very well when it works. And I certainly think that supporting marriage should be part of any public policy set that we have concerning families, without doubt. Maybe there'll be some time in the future when, like Sweden, it won't seem to matter here whether you get married in the sense that cohabiting couples will stay together for decades the way they seem to in Sweden and France. We're not there yet. Our cohabiting couples don't do that. They break up pretty quickly. So marriage is part of it. But I would add to that list something else, which is slow down. That is to say, while marriage may be a very good way of providing stability to kids, the second best way might be a stable single mother who never has a partner re-enter her house and therefore never breaks up, who may be able to provide stability and security for kids in a way that could be as good or even better than if there were a series of partners in the house. So I would say that we should encourage people to slow down, to get off the merry-go-round, so to speak, in order to support kids better. That we should tell people not to have somebody move into their house if their kid's around, unless they're sure that the relationship is going to last. Is there anything we could do about this as a nation in terms of policy? I do think there's some ways in which we could support stable marriages without encouraging the kind of short-term cohabitation and breakup that we've seen. For example, there was a random assignment study of something called career academies, which are high schools within high schools that provide an education in a particular field like business or computers, aimed at kids who probably aren't going to go to college, who have the same set of teachers, take courses together, and focus in on these business aspects. These kids tend to get jobs better than other kids, and a random assignment study which randomly assigned some kids to be in these career academies and other kids not to, followed these kids up for 8 years following graduation, and found that the kids who were in the career academies were more likely to be living as a married partner with children 8 years later. But they were not any more likely to be living with somebody outside of marriage with kids. It's as if the better job prospects, on the one hand, it made marriage possible, but also enabled young adults to kind of avoid some of the short-term partnerships that they might otherwise have started because two can live more cheaply than one, because the lights are about to be turned out and therefore one would like to take a partner. These kinds of supports for young adults may be pro-marriage and pro-stability in the sense of encouraging marriage without encouraging short-term unions. That's what we have to do. There have been several government random experiments in the manpower field, none of which had anything to do with marriage when they were started, which tend to show that supporting work, providing resources to young adults, enhance stable marriage, but do not enhance unstable cohabiting unions. So it's possible that we could do something about this. But in any case, it's very clear to me that we're operating at a much faster speed than we have at any time in the nation's past, probably at any time in the Western world's past as well. It's as though we've sped up the hands on the relationship clock. The kinds of partnership turnover I've talked about is rooted in the cultural contradictions I've mentioned to you. In a nation where both marriage and individualism are important. It's accelerated with the growth of cohabiting relationships, which really have zoomed up all of the multiple partnerships that we've seen. And as a result, we highly value partnerships, but ours don't last very long. We may get more personal fulfillment from them, but we don't get much more stability, and they're easily broken. And all this, although this situation may be acceptable to many adults, I would argue that American children would fare better if we could slow down the American marriage and cohabitation go round. Thank you.
I think there was a message, but there was a wonderful tour de force and a terrific education. And I think what we saw was from the Krieger School, the benefit of research and scholarship linked to a real love of education. And we got that seat in a very special classroom. So Professor Cherlin has willingly said that he would stay to take some of our questions. I know some of you are expecting to leave. But let me open the floor now and ask, if you would, tell us who you are, what affiliation you have. We don't mean your marital status. And then just go ahead and ask your question. Anybody wants to start? Yes, please. And mics are coming.
My name is Andrew Pierre. I'm in this room fairly frequently for lectures on foreign affairs. So it's nice to have a different topic. And I must say, when I saw that, it made me think about a marriage which we're reading about every day in the press. That is of Clarence Thomas's wife and Anita Hill, and that whole controversy. And this is a mini question. I'm kind of wondering whether you think in a marriage of 20 years, Clarence Thomas's wife, that a man is able to pull the wool over his wife's eyes for 20 years and get her to believe something other than the real story, because that might be what is the case. You may not want to get into that, but I was thinking a bit when I came here about the differences.
Andrew, and I'm going to ask you, because just in case there are others to ask your question. Yes, please.
Let's talk about 20-year marriages, okay? They're less common than they used to be. And it used to be that one stayed with a marriage even if one was unhappy. Even if your husband was not successful in pulling the wool over your eyes, one stayed with the relationship, especially if there were children. That's what most people thought 50 years ago, and most of them did. That has changed dramatically right now. You don't stay with that relationship now. You saw that even all those people who said marriage is exceptional, relationships that should never be ended, most of them thought that the relationship could be ended if one person thought so. So I'm not going to judge 20-year marriages. I salute them. They're not as many as there used to be, and they do some good for stability. But the way we view those relationships is much more difficult than we used to.
Yes, Mateus, right here.
Thank you very much, Professor.
A name
Cherlin.
and affiliation.
Matthias, I'm a SAIS,
Belgian.
a SAIS alum,
That tiny little percentage down there at the bottom.
and I'm a professor of political economy at American University. I have a question about divorce. I'd be interested to see your view on this, because it's my impression that in the United States and the UK, countries that are more individualistic, these big divorce cases, especially when it's big money involved, even if there's a prenuptial agreement or anything, usually a judge will give, usually the woman, at least half of the estate of the man, right? Well, I've seen a couple of Belgian cases where the judge would say to the divorcee, well, why don't you go and get a job? And interestingly enough, in the US and the UK, the concept of fairness in divorce, especially after a long period with usually children, seems to be taken much more into account, and a judge is willing to get rid of prenuptial agreements than in continental Europe.
Yes, and more generally, what's happened is American law has moved away from supporting traditional marriage towards supporting individuals, including wives, who in the old kind of marriage did not get much from their husbands necessarily. And so what one sees now is that wives will be more likely to be listened to in a case. What one sees now is that what matters more. Like another example, if I have fathered a child, it matters much less to judges whether I'm married to the mother of the child. That used to be the case, okay? It used to be, in fact, in most states, it still is the case, believe it or not, that if a married woman has a child, it's her husband's child, even if a DNA test shows that there's another father. This is an old way of thinking about children. That is, they're the property of husbands. We need them on the farm. And we're not going to let another man steal the fertility of our wives. There was an old way of thinking about wives too, which they were the husband's property. Okay, and family law has moved away from that a great deal over the last 50 years, and kind of the individualization of American family law. The fact that what matters now more is parenthood rather than marriage per se is a major trend.
Interesting. Yes, Dean Wilson, Bonnie Wilson.
I'm just wondering if the lower divorce rate in some of the other European countries is because the adultery is more condoned, or is it more condoned? That's always been the excuse I've heard.
I've been looking for the chart that has France on top of the adultery bars, but I've not found it. In fact, I've not found an adultery chart, so I can't, being a demographer, I can't answer your question. Everyone asks me that question. Everybody says, we all know that what happens, and usually it's France that they're talking about. We all know, okay? We all know that they have relationships on the side. That's kind of the pressure valve releaser, if you will. And so therefore the pressure doesn't build up in the marriage, and that's why they have a lower divorce rate. I can't really speak to that, okay? Perhaps there is something to that. I'm not an expert on French culture, and certainly you can't find, unfortunately, any hard data to support that, but it's certainly the opinion of many people that and the implication is if only we had the escape valve here more, perhaps we'd have less divorce. A tough sell, but one which I suppose could matter.
Yes, in the back, please.
Yes, Marcel Ricoux, I'm a second-year student here at SAIS. My question is, you talk about you compare different axes, religious and not, and kind of the one that I thought might have was left off was the political aspect. You alluded to it, that other book you referred to. But it seems to me, and I might betray my biases, but it seems to me that a lot of what you described is extremely interesting, but describes the Republican Party or their policies, the idea of small state, but a small government that intrudes in your bedroom. Does your analysis differ in blue states versus red states, or blue families versus red families? Yeah.
Yes, it does. It does for sure. Let me say why, and then a bit about what I think about this. If you take the states with the 10 highest divorce rates in 2008, 8 of them voted against Obama. 8 of them voted for McCain. In 2004, if you take the states with the 10 highest divorce rates, all of them voted for Bush. That is to say, there is a group of families out there that tend to cluster in states that have voted Republican, who have this characteristic of lots of divorce, lots of marriage, and lots of divorce, the same kind of turnover that I've been talking about. In fact, it's the college-educated Americans whose divorce rate has been going down. It's the case that the divorce rate's been going up for the least educated, down for the college-educated. So you have a large group of families in states that have voted Republican who look like there's much of this chaos and much of this turnover, and whose political positions seem to be quite conservative. For example, the position on same-sex marriage would be quite conservative. So there's no question that there are strong differences between family life in red states and blue states. Part of that, however, is because the red states tend to have things like lower education. There are fewer people who graduate from college in red states, like, say, Oklahoma or Kentucky or West Virginia. And therefore, there are fewer people who have the steady jobs and the culture that the college-educated have. And so one finds that there is right now a strong difference between the way families tend to think about the moral world in states that have voted Republican or Democrat in the past. I, however, would caution that that doesn't mean it's going to stay that way until in the future. I would caution that I think some of that is the fact that as jobs for high school educated people have dried up, the kinds of family lives that families are leading in many of the red states are not working for them, leading to frustration, anger, susceptibility perhaps to political positions based on anger or fear. And that what one is seeing is a dissatisfied, confused, now let's not use the word dissatisfied, unsure of the way the world is heading group of families. This is the way they're voting now. However, I think it's quite possible that they could vote differently in 2 years, 4 years, or 8 years. And I think it's quite possible that families, the blue state families, could evolve too. So, yes, there are differences now, but let's not assume there are ironclad differences between the typical family in Arkansas and the typical family in Massachusetts. That will always be the case, and that one can very easily stereotype them. I would caution against that. There are many people in Arkansas who have the individual and marriage models. There are many people in Massachusetts who do too. Let's watch this carefully and allow for some kind of social change.
If I can ask a question, a follow-up somewhat on that. You mentioned a couple of times in your lecture that there might be income effects that prevent people from getting married. But the common wisdom, not the demographers' deep knowledge, is that we always hear that the children of single parents are the poverty of America. That marriage, and that sort of leads to the bus in Baltimore that says get married, stay married. So typically the social policy as it's been distilled from Washington at least, has been that income security comes from the two and that poverty comes from being in a household without. So it was surprising to learn from you that income seemed to be the stresses, that income stresses rather than being alleviated by marriage seem to be an obstacle to marriage in some cases.
You know, marriage used to be the first step into adulthood. And then you got a job and you got income security, you bought a house. Today, marriage is for the college educated, the last step into adulthood, okay? It's the one you take when everything else is already done, okay? For people who are not going to college, however, there is a gray area here where they're following an old model that said graduate from high school, get a job at a steel corporation, if you're the husband, have kids if you're the wife, and you can lead a decent life. That progression, graduate from high school, get a decent job, has really disappeared. But the cultural understanding of it is still there. There is still a sense among many of the high school educated that one ought to try to get married. And there's still a sense that if one gets your girlfriend pregnant, you might want to marry that person instead of getting an abortion. So there is a kind of, I would say, transitional phase going on in the families of the high school educated where they're trying to live according to the old rules. The old rules aren't working. What they're doing instead of marrying is living with a partner now, having a kid with that partner, not marrying because they don't think they have the economic wherewithal to marry, but finding that that relationship only lasts a few years, at which point they try another one. So one is trying very hard for the old-style marriage model in an atmosphere where it doesn't work that well, and it's causing lots of turnover and much divorce among the non-college educated.
Another question, yes. 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll look at the clock. 1.
Good evening. My name is Sani Jasmine, and I have a two-part question if I'm allowed to have one. The first question is, what role do you think the media plays in influencing marriage and divorce rates, considering we have reality shows such as The Flavor of Love, Jersey Shore, Who Wants to Marry a Millionaire? I can go on and on. What role do you think they play? And second, before I came here, I had the notion that minorities had the highest divorce rates, but you told us that that wasn't true. And why do you think why do you think there's a possibility that many Americans had that notion that minorities have the highest divorce rates?
Can I do the second one first? I'll do the second one first. Minorities have high rates of children outside of marriage, but they don't necessarily have partners, okay? So it would be a different story if I was saying to you which groups in America have the highest rate of unpartnered childbearing. But to get divorced, you've got to get married. And in many minority communities, marriage is fading away. In fact, in many minority communities, young adults will say, we don't know anybody who's married. In some of the marriage promotion projects that have developed that the government has supported, that's what they found, that young adults in very poor neighborhoods say, we don't have any models for marriage. So marriage has kind of faded away. Childbearing outside of marriage has not. What role does the media play? I've always thought that the law both ratifies and supports changes. That is to say, I think the law and the media as well both tell us what we already think and help us to keep thinking it. So in the 1950s, when we watched Leave It to Beaver, which maybe you've found channel surfing at midnight in some TV show, or Father Knows Best, these classic 50s families, it told us what we already believed about families, but it reinforced it. Now, if you watch any of the shows that you've mentioned, it tells us something very different about what we believe about marriage and reinforces it. So TV producers want people to watch their shows, so they develop shows that they think have a big audience. And if they think a big audience will be for a non-marital family, as many of them do now, they'll put it on. So clearly it's not just TV, it's not just media, it's not just the law, but what the media and the law and the other messages we see every day do is both ratify what it is we think we know, but also reinforce it in a way that makes it harder to change.
There was another hand here and here, right? So those two for this.
My name is Lesiga Derrick. Professor, religion seems to be a mixed blessing for the American families. What, based on your extensive research and experience, is your take on this issue of family and religion to the American family?
The issue of family and religion?
Yes.
My take is that religion can be a very important positive force in people's lives and in families' lives. And I think in general it is. And I have great respect for many religious leaders that I know personally or that I've heard of who are working very hard to support families, to mitigate inequalities. But I have to say that American religion is a bit double-edged, okay? It's not what people think it is when they think of it as totally conservative and traditional. It's different from religions in other countries that are both conservative and traditional. Here it's the case that religion has always been, well, American religion, which means that it's about you, it has a self-orientation that is a component of what we hear about in a religious service. That's not to criticize religion as much as to say, well, what did you expect in American religion? That's the kind of religion we have, because that's the kind of values we have, and one must take all of that in understanding what American religion is all about.
Actually, I think, and I will turn to the question, it's interesting because, of course, we had Year of Religion at SAIS last year, and I think one of the things that we learned together was that, for example, the church is changing dramatically in Latin America. Catholicism is losing very much ground to Protestantism, and we know that the spread of those churches are also existing in Africa. And so the notion of a church in which you're invited to have an individual transcendental relationship with God in order to pursue virtuous objectives, as opposed to a church that's grounded in a hierarchical authority, is something that actually may be an export from the United States, but it's certainly got a lot of import interest across Latin America, Africa, and indeed in Christian churches in China and other places. So it would be interesting to know whether this is something that will have legs, so to speak, in international affairs. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Anna Maria Sundby, and I'm from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And I have a question regarding the turnover rate that you were talking about earlier. And that women or mothers with a high school education are most likely to have multiple partners, and to not multiple at the same time, but turnover. And to what extent do you think that could be explained by a lack of general public support, as in child care benefits and social support?
Yes, first of all, let me say that demographers tend to measure how women are doing in family lives kind of as a reflex, because demography in the US as elsewhere started out as the study of babies, okay, and women had them. So let me say that just as many men have those unstable and multiple partnerships as women, even though I put women up there on my chart. This is certainly not a women's issue. Women and men are doing it too. You could argue that there's less turnover in Europe because of the kind of policies that may stabilize people's lives. That is to say, the fact that there's more generous family policies in many European countries could be a way in which a woman or a man with a child who is facing being evicted from their apartment because they don't have enough money to pay the rent can get the money that they need. In the US, you might have to let somebody into your home to be your partner to get that money. In Britain or France, you might be able to have some kind of grant or family allowance that doesn't allow it. So surely, policy could make a difference here.
Yes, we have a couple of more questions, but I think we're going to conclude, and I'll ask Felissa to tell us when the last question for 7 o'clock for a reception that awaits us. So blindly over there, and then 2. Yes, please.
Good evening, Alexis Spiller from Germany, second year SAIS MA student, and I concentrate in conflict management, and we usually focus on international conflicts, so it's interesting to hear something about more domestic conflicts in that sense. You talked about some socioeconomic factors, both in the presentation and now in the Q&A, job security, things like that, education. So I wonder if the US enters a new golden age and kind of, has big economic growth, which is sustainable, broadens the middle class, elevates or mitigates income inequality, just like Sweden perhaps, which has lower, lower Genie coefficient, etc. Would that mean that, with more stability in that sense, would that mean that marriage would be on the rise again, or would that actually, due to cultural factors and other things you talked about, could not be the case? What do you think about economic growth and how that would influence marriage?
I think economic growth and prosperity would increase marriage and decrease divorce. And the reason I'm saying that is I've watched what's happened to the college-educated people in this country over the last few decades, okay? Ever since the 1980s, the divorce rate has been going down for the people who I would judge to be the winners in our globalized economy, okay? The people who can get good positions, while it's been staying the same or going up for the least educated, the people who are having the most trouble. I've watched the age at marriage recently increase the most for people at the bottom, who are increasingly giving up on marriage because they can't find the economic wherewithal to do it. Whereas marriage is still very important if delayed among the college-educated, nearly all of whom get married. Among the college-educated in the US, among college-educated women, 95% wait until after they're married to have a baby, okay? Not much out of wedlock childbearing. Those are the people who can see a path, a conventional path to economic success and family success, and who wait for it. Those who can't see the path aren't following that model anymore. So I do think that that would help.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. Okay. Hi, Professor. Thanks. My name is Ade Falai. I'm a first year here. From the premise of the title of your presentation, it kind of insinuates that there's something about developed versus everyone else. I wanted to know if in your research you sort of maybe did a little study on the developing side, maybe to buttress some of your findings. And then also, based on that, I tend to get the impression that your conclusion is that the US is in some ways almost similar to a developing country. In either some of the value systems, and I wanted to know if it's more on the, especially as it relates to the marriage question, if it's more on the religious aspect or the self-expression aspect.
Well, it's complicated. In terms of religious fervor, the U.S. is closer to a developing country than to some developing countries. I mean, our church-going rates are higher to are closer to Mexico's than, say, Sweden's. But the individualism, okay, the self-development, I don't see that yet in many developing countries. So that while I do see the strength of religion in many developing countries, I don't yet see what may be emerging, but I don't yet see the self-development. Now, you might think that perhaps as development proceeds, as economic development proceeds, self-development will too. In fact, I know a number of people in developing countries who are afraid of that that's exactly what's going to happen. But right now, that second part of my cultural contradiction, the part that's about me and my personal development and my individual satisfaction, is what I see less in many developing countries. And the reason why I'm drawing a line separating developed from developing is I don't want to pretend that I know a lot about developing countries, that I don't want to pretend that the same relationships that I find in developed countries can be applied willy-nilly to developing countries. Too many developed country theorists have tried to do that in the past, and I want to make sure that we don't create that error again.
When we had our original conversation and I spoke about the world, Professor Cherlin was quite clear about what he studied and knew and what he might think about, but hadn't studied and wouldn't be prepared to teach others about. So that was a very good distinction, and I thank you for mentioning it tonight.
That's the demographer in me, and that's the year of demography.
Well, it's the Johns Hopkins in you, too, so we thank the provost for bringing that to us. I think we can express our great appreciation and move on.